Hello and welcome, my friends, into episode number 157 of the Leaning into Leadership podcast. My guest on the show today is Colleen Bashar. Now, let me tell you this about Colleen. She is an enterprise software operations and sales executive with a successful record of building business units and teams from the ground up. She's opened new markets and delivered consistent year over year 20% revenue growth at Guidewire, which is a multi-billion-dollar public company where she serves as SVP of Enterprise Business Operations and as the Chief of Staff. Colleen and I sat down and had a conversation about what she calls raw leadership, where we're really leaning into vulnerability, authenticity, and curiosity. I was fascinated by what Colleen had to say about building leadership teams and about how incredibly important trust is as a component in developing those teams. If you've been paying attention to the podcast over the last few months, you know that leadership teams has become a very, very strong focus for me, both in my professional life and then also as a learner. Something I'm really focused on, something I want to continue to grow and get better at, is understanding all the dynamics that go into developing, nurturing, and maintaining strong leadership teams. And this conversation today with Colleen Bashar, I think takes us well down the road in that direction. I think you're going to love this conversation, folks. It's really great. I really appreciate Colleen joining me here on the show. You're going to get the whole thing right after this. So, if you're a regular listener on the show, you know that organizational culture and climate is something very near and dear to my heart. When I think back on my early leadership career, flipping the culture of our organization was probably one of the smartest investments that we made when we were really intentional about focusing on the things people were doing right and stopped focusing on all the things that they were doing wrong. It was incredible how our organization changed. And that's going to be kind of the core of today's conversation. Joining me on the show is Colleen Bashar, and she has created or is going to tell us a story about raw leadership, and culture is going to be at the core of that. And I'm really excited about this conversation because culture to me is such a critical element. So Colleen, thank you for joining me on the show.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. Like I said, I'm really looking forward to this. I think this is going to be great. But to maybe set the stage for our listeners today, let's do this. Let's maybe have you maybe rewind a little ways, back to whenever you would like to go back to, and give us a little bit of background on who Colleen Bashar is, how you have maybe discovered or come to this point with raw leadership, and honestly, just what brings you here to the Leaning into Leadership podcast.
All right. Going back in time. So if I think about my timeline, I went to school for biomedical engineering, which is something that I'm not using today. After I graduated, I became a professional ski bum. So there's a little inside knowledge for me, is that is my passion, is skiing. And I moved out west to sort of chase that passion. I then quickly had to get back into the real world, and I joined Oracle. Got my MBA on the side, and then joined the company that I'm with today, Guidewire Software. For the first 16 years of my journey at Guidewire, I led an organization that was a global subject matter expert team focused on sales. That team grew when I joined. I joined as an individual contributor of that team, and I think there were 6 of us. And when I left the leadership of that team, there was 150. And that organization had something special. There was really longevity in the leadership team, and that leadership team had a lot of trust. And from that, we sort of created a culture within a culture. 2 years ago, I left that team and felt like it was time for other leaders to run that organization, and I moved to the operations side. So I am now the head of business operations and also the chief of staff to the CEO. That's sort of my journey
Yeah.
as to how I got here.
Yeah, no, that's outstanding. I love that. You hit on some pieces there that I just want to go right to them.
Okay.
When I spend time working with schools around the country, one of the biggest challenges, I'll say, that many schools run into, and one of the biggest reasons that some schools struggle is lack of longevity in leadership. And you talked in there about just that continuity of leadership within that team. And I'm sure that probably had a lot to do with not only the success of the team, but also of the size of the team and how the team continued to grow because there was that core strong leadership. Can you talk just a little bit more about that piece? We'll get to culture within a culture in a couple of minutes, but I want to hear a little bit more about that longevity within the leadership team.
That's super interesting that you bring that up, because I feel like nowadays it's actually seen as a negative when you are going through a large transformation. Lots of people will pinpoint the individuals in the organization that have been there for a long time as not willing to change. They're stuck in their old ways. And I don't believe that to be true if the leader has really created a, change, open mindset organization. So I tend to disagree with a lot of people when we're going through transformations within our organization that struggle to have high tenured people on that transformation team, because I think it is so driven by the leader and what kind of environment they create, what kind of culture they're creating within that environment. I think that's what can really drive the change. So I had an organization where the leadership team was all at Guidewire for 12 to 15 years, which within our team created trust. It created a sort of a safety net to create an environment where people could take a risk. That doesn't always happen, but that's sort of the culture that I really stand by, is creating a culture where people feel safe and are encouraged to take a risk.
And that's a big part of why I wanted to have this conversation with you here on the show. You and I are so like-minded in that area. I hear that frequently too. That maybe changing the leader is the thing that's going to help change the organization.
Yeah.
And sometimes that's true. I mean, it's not that leaders need to always stay in their position. Sometimes leaders who have been in a place for a long time need a fresh outlook. Sometimes the teams need fresh leadership, but there is a lot to be said for continuity, for consistency, and for a handful of reasons, one of which you hit really, really well, and that is creating that culture of trust. And certainly you can create a culture of trust with newer leaders, but when you have been around people, you know what to expect, how they are going to react, what their expectations are going to be. I think it certainly makes that a lot easier. But I think, both in industry and certainly in education, there continues to be that struggle. You mentioned it, kind of the set in their ways, the most dangerous phrase, well, we've always done it that way, certainly can be pervasive there. Yeah. Let's just stay on this just for a couple minutes more, and talk a little bit more about that mindset around developing trust within an organization, and how that consistency in leadership is just so important.
Trust for me is the underlying foundation of all of it. Once you can dig in with your tight-knit leadership team and build a certain level of trust, that's when the high performance and the loyalty come, because you can have conflict and you're not hurting anyone's feelings. You can create an environment where people can be honest. You can have accountability. People can own things. It goes back to the courage, but they have the courage to take a risk because they trust their leadership. They know that the leadership is going to come to them and bring conflict if conflict is needed. And conflict is not a bad word. It's very healthy. An organization without conflict is not good. It just becomes a political environment. You want to have healthy conflict so that you can get to the right decisions at the right time, create the accountability needed. None of that is possible without trust. When I started building leadership teams, trust is really hard to build. And I would use tips and tricks from Pat Lencioni, who has a sort of a workbook that you can look into where it gives you exercises you can do with your team that help build trust. And they are incredibly uncomfortable. Everyone in the room hates it. We go through the exercise and then everyone in the room feels different. They feel different with each other. They feel different as a member of the team. They feel closer. And all of that just leads to that high performance and loyalty that you want to grow across the organization, not just with your leadership team, but it has to start with the leadership team.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, so much of what we're talking about really, I mean, you mentioned Lencioni's work, the 5 dysfunctions of a team. I mean, we're hitting those like as we go through here, and definitely some amazing pieces that go into that, and without trust, and my recollection of that book, I read it again recently. Trust was, that number one dysfunction of a team, and when we don't have that, and when we're not able to have productive conflict. I love how you talked about productive conflict. I think that's something that's really, really important. And I think the last thing I'll say on this, and then I want to bounce just a little bit to a slightly different direction, is just when you talk about organizations creating or leaders creating within the organization that trust that allows for risk to take place. To me, that's where innovation actually happens, when leaders create a culture where they lead from fear. I refer to it as punishment to gain compliance. That is what completely stops innovation in its tracks, because people aren't going to take risk when they can't trust the leader, when they can't trust the environment, when they can't trust others around them, and when they see conflict truly as, infighting or something that is going to tear the team down. So that's just a little bit of my own processing on that.
Yeah, I agree with you. 100%.
What you're talking about.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's that fear of not being allowed to be wrong. And if you feel like you can't be wrong, you're not going to try anything new ever.
Right. Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. Oh man, that's such good stuff. And it ties into where I want to go next, which really is talking more about development of that organizational culture. I mean, again, you've talked about vulnerability, authenticity, and curiosity as being real keys to building that organizational culture. That's that raw leadership that you've talked about. So maybe let's kind of chase after that just a little bit and talk about that creation of organizational culture.
Okay. So it somewhat came about naturally, and it wasn't until members of my team started to tell me, you really got to put this down on paper because you have something here. And that was just the leadership philosophy that I was following when I was running the solution sales organization. As I grew, and I'm constantly investing in myself, as I learned more about myself, that's when I realized that when I am my true authentic self, I'm a different leader. That led to the idea of vulnerability and what that can bring to you as a leader, and then curiosity. I'll explain all 3 of these in a second, but when I wrapped that together, all that was to me was standing up as a leader and being raw. I describe that as just being myself and not trying to be someone else or trying to fit into a specific persona that matches the rest of the organization. It was just being authentic. And I drove into the authenticity piece when I was doing some leadership training, and I realized that I was showing up differently when I would lead my organization of 150 people or when I would walk into the C-suite room. I showed up as two different people. And it wasn't until somebody had the courage to point that out that I realized it. And going through that work of how do you show up as your authentic self can date all the way back to when you look at a 2-year-old who's dancing around, acting like themselves, and they do not care at all who is looking at them or what they are saying. Everybody had that experience. And then slowly, as you get older, you start to create these, negative personas of, I shouldn't do it that way. I can't do this. I'm not enough. Yeah. And it creates a different persona that you don't even realize is happening. When you can get back to yourself, you will realize how amazing a conversation can be because you're not in your head.
Yeah. I'm curious. I don't want to derail your train of thought, but I don't want to lose this. Why do you feel that you specifically showed up differently for your team versus the C-suite?
As I dug into that, this is probably not going to go where you thought it was going to go. I realized that that was a trigger from my childhood. From my childhood, there was a trigger that was created around authority, the need to show up a certain way for specific authority figures in my life. And that fear of not showing up that way came out in a C-suite room versus the team that I created. Two very different environments. I should be the same leader in both environments, but I got triggered by that, sort of fear of authority in that C-suite room. And it took somebody pointing out to me that they didn't know why, but they knew that I was acting different because they'd seen me in both situations and gave me the challenge of, you got to go figure out why. And that's how I dug into how to find your power by bringing out that authenticity.
I love that. I love that. I appreciate, number one, I appreciate you sharing that. We certainly didn't, say that we were going to talk about that. So not trying to psychoanalyze you. I was just really curious because I think so many people, that's pretty common where, I'll behave a certain way here, but a different way here. And for leaders, man, I think a lot of leaders have this dual persona or even more, right? Mm-hmm. And we need to be our true authentic self. So talk about how we do that. How do we be raw, our own authentic self?
I think one of the ways is to acknowledge inside when you feel a trigger. So that authority figure trigger that I had, I can literally feel when it happens. I may not mentally notice it until I have now learned about that trigger, but my heart will speed up. I'll become warmer. You can physically feel when you're not being your authentic self. That's the first thing. The second thing is vulnerability. I think when you show courage, which to me, vulnerability is the outward expression of courage. It's impossible to be courageous without vulnerability. When you are willing to be vulnerable, it is very natural to be authentic. It's sort of, they go hand in hand. It's very hard to be vulnerable and fake. And to be vulnerable, you got to be courageous. You got to be willing to take a risk. You got to be willing to push for a vision that you have zero clue how you're going to get there. And you have to have the courage to be wrong. And as a leader, it's your responsibility to set up an environment so that your team can do that.
So as you began this journey, building this leadership team, being this raw leader, what were some intentional steps that you took, or what were some things that maybe you told yourself either about how you were going to show up that day, or individuals you wanted to make sure you got involved? I mean, what were some steps that you took that helped to build and create that success?
I'll talk about two things. So one was the idea of being raw and vulnerable. We had a sales organization that was driven by the typical sales mentality of like a large corporation like Oracle, where it's all business. You get your number and you overachieve. My organization was part of the overall sales kickoff, and we had a separate session where I decided to talk to this team about how our team was different. And I shared a very vulnerable story that I had recently gone through with my youngest child, who had open heart surgery when he was 1. And some of the realization that I came to from that experience, where I was, he was in a induced coma, and I was thinking about putting the compensation numbers into a spreadsheet. And what that meant to me as a leader was that I was in an environment where I didn't feel safe. I don't know if safe is the right word, but I didn't feel like I had the right to say, I'm not going to do that right now. Somebody else on my team has the power to do that. I'm pushing it off because I felt like I needed to prove something. I did not want that environment created for anyone else on my team. And so I talked about how in this organization, we are going to be there for each other. When any other person on your team has personal chaos, the whole team will take over and let that person deal with their personal chaos and not think about work. And then the favor will be returned, because every single person in this world has personal chaos of some sort at some time. And creating an environment where people felt protected is going to make everybody work harder, because there's something innate in you that wants to work harder for an organization that's going to cover you when you need it. So I shared my story. The meeting was over. We went through the rest of like our fiscal year goals. I think I always pick a word for the year, and I think that word that year was courage. And at the end of the day, we had some sort of event, and so many people came up to me and talked to me about the very beginning of my meeting, where I talked about the vulnerable story. And the people that were coming to me, I thought were going to be moms, right? Oh my gosh, I can't believe you went through that. And they weren't.
Yeah.
They were men. They were men who felt like they could never talk about that at work, because there's a stereotype of like a mom can quickly go off and pick their kid up from school in the middle of a workday, but men don't feel as comfortable saying that, as a simple example. But all of these men kept coming up to me saying, oh my God, I've been going through X, Y, and Z, and I haven't told anybody about it. And thank you for saying that. And it just brought this realization to me of like, I got to create an environment where people feel like they can raise their hand when they need help. So that's where the vulnerability kicked in, which then led to the importance of courage.
I think that's so powerful. And I think leaders, this is a huge lesson to take away from today's episode. That willingness to be vulnerable and to just be authentic, be real, be yourself, and allow those around you to see you as a human being is just so critical. Mm-hmm. We do, no matter what the walk of life you're in, whether you're in education, the private sector, nonprofit, whatever you might be doing for a living, when we allow ourselves to be consumed by that work, when we allow ourselves, like Colleen is talking about here, to not be willing to set something aside when we're dealing with personal chaos, as you described it. And honestly, Colleen, you telling that story made me think of two different stories. where something happening and here I am still at work, either physically or just in my mind, or
Mm-hmm.
on the work cell phone or whatever. And like you said, there were other members of my team who were capable of handling that. And being intentional, I love how you did that. Being intentional and telling your team, we are different because we are going to treat each other this way. We're going to
Mm-hmm.
value each other as human beings. I think it's just unbelievably powerful. And I say it all the time, when we're in leadership, we're in the people business. I mean, yeah, you're in software, I'm in education, somebody might be in military, somebody might be whatever. We're in the people business when we're leaders. And when we don't stay connected to the people side of it, it's so easy to get lost.
Yeah,
Um,
for
I,
sure.
I'm just going to throw it back to you and just to let you react on that before I go to my last question of the show. I want to just let you talk a little bit more.
I could not agree more. I feel like there is a lot of leaders out there that put their job responsibilities as their main, if not only, responsibility. They don't think of the leadership piece of it. They don't think of the intentionality you need to get people to follow you, to get people motivated and engaged, to believe in whatever it is that you're trying to get this organization to do. They forget about that part. And I think that part is really important because every single person has a different motivational trigger, or you can use the love languages, however you want to explain it. And you've got to reach every single one of those people with whatever, leadership philosophy you have, which is not easy to do. So it's incredibly important, and I think a lot more people could put a little more emphasis on it and see the
Yeah,
drastic impact it can have.
totally agree with you. I think that maybe one of the big separators between really good leaders and great leaders is
Mm-hmm.
never losing sight of the human side of that work. Oh, just love it so much. So,
Yeah.
man, we could just keep going and going and going on this. But we have reached that point in the show. I'm going to ask you the same question I ask everybody here on the podcast. So it's the Leaning into Leadership podcast. So, Colleen, how are you leaning into leadership right now?
Jose, I'm doing a couple things. One is I am trying to share my stories and my perspective on leadership with more people. I'm also sharing a perspective coming out soon on the evolution of the chief of staff role, or my perspective on it. I'm also trying to create new forms of leadership training within our team. One of the brilliant folks that report to me is creating more about high performing teams versus how do you need to be trained as a manager? How do you need to create, or what do you need to create a high performing team? So creating more of that type of structure for our organization. And then I'm always trying to soak any type of leadership training in, from podcasts to books to anything I can get. Investing in myself is something that I always prioritize.
I think that's outstanding, man. Just so many great things. I really appreciate you coming on the show. If people want to get in touch with you, how do they find Colleen Bashar?
You can find me on LinkedIn. I think all of my contact information is there, including my email and everything. So please feel free to reach out.
Absolutely. And we'll make sure, folks, that is linked in the show notes as well, so you can get in touch with Colleen. Colleen, thank you so much for coming on, sharing your story, sharing what raw leadership really is all about. This has been a fantastic conversation. I really appreciate you coming on, joining me on the show.
Thank you so much.
Once again, I want to thank Colleen Bashar for coming on the Leaning into Leadership podcast. Fantastic conversation. Some really great stuff there shared by Colleen on raw leadership. Love all three parts that she brought to the table there. Make sure, folks, get down there in the show notes, click on her website, follow her on LinkedIn. You will definitely be happy that you got connected with her. And now it's time for a pep talk. This week on the pep talk, I want to talk a little bit more about one of the 3 points that Colleen brought up in raw leadership. Specifically, I want to talk about authenticity. And I want to challenge you to take a look at yourself, kind of get up on the balcony. You know what I'm talking about here with the balcony level leadership. I want you to get up on the balcony and check yourself. Check yourself on how authentic you are as a member of your leadership team. Check your team in terms of how authentic are the members of the team with each other. Colleen did a great job talking about this and why authenticity is so important. But when we put up a facade, when we put barriers around ourselves or in our small cliques that sometimes happen within leadership teams, what happens is we stop having those genuine, open, authentic relationships and communications that are so critical to a leadership team being highly functional. And it only can begin with you taking a look at yourself. Just like I talked about in Road to Awesome, I had to look at myself as the leader. I couldn't change anybody else, but I could sure start to show up a little bit differently as a leader. So check yourself this week. How authentic are you genuinely being with the members of your team? And how authentic are the relationships between the members of your leadership team? If the answer is not one that makes you happy, that's an area to lean into and to start focusing on developing authentic relationships within the team and showing up as your authentic self. That's what I got for you this week, folks. Thank you so much for listening to the Leaning into Leadership podcast. As always, thank you for the reviews. Thank you for the 5-star ratings. Every one of those just helps that many more people find their way to the Leaning into Leadership podcast. So thank you again. Get out there. Have a Road to Awesome week.